In this video, we address some literary aspects of the world of the fourth gospel from both a diachronic approach and a synchronic approach. And so how I want to start us out is by recalling what it is we're talking about when we're talking about a diachronic approach to engaging the world of the text, and what it is we're talking about when we talk about a synchronic approach to the world of the text. So go ahead and pause the video here and name the differences, or name the major difference between these two different approaches. All right, now that you've come back, here is what we have from that last video that explains our differences between the diachronic and the synchronic approaches to the world of the text. Remember, the diachronic approach is really sort of a world behind the text, or the text behind the text, as it were. The text history, the sources that might have been used, the way that the text came together. So it's really, the diachronic approach is really interested in looking at the text in order to figure out some things about how the text came together and how that might matter in different kinds of ways. The synchronic approach, in contrast, is going to be focused on the text itself, addressing the text as we have it, and is going to look at elements within the final form of the text. So we're going to take a look at both of these sort of ways of approaching the world of the text in this video with respect to the Gospel of John. And we're going to start with the diachronic approach, focusing again on the text sort of back history. And for a really long time in Johannine scholarship, this was the sort of predominant way to approach the text of John's Gospel. Much of Johannine scholarship was concerned with figuring out sort of the different sources that went into the final form of the Gospel as we have it, and then also trying to determine what those different sources might suggest about the person who wrote them and how they related to their community or various communities. So this is we talked about in New Testament, the introduction to the New Testament class, this idea of the Johannine community and how the different sort of sources of John's gospel might have been used by that community or those communities at different times and responding to different social circumstances. And this will be something that shows up in your readings this semester, the idea of the Johannine community, the kind of social and cultural issues they might have been facing, and how different parts of the gospel are reflecting those dynamics. And we'll talk more about some of these things with respect to the world behind the text of John, and we'll see how sort of the diachronic approach to the world of the text in some ways lines up with what we explore and what we think about the world behind the text of John as a whole. So the sorts of things that brought it about. What was the genesis of the Gospel of John? Why was it written? What kind of circumstances were going on that might have necessitated such a gospel? And how do certain aspects of the history and culture of the first century Jesus movement, how are those reflected in the Gospel of John? And so we sort of have this linking up of these different literary themes, these different sources, and the history of the writers of the text itself. But all of that is, again, something to look forward to next time when we talk more about the world behind John. At this point, we want to lay out some of the different ways that we see these different sources or these different themes at work in the Gospel of John. The sort of main entry point that you'll see for these kinds of different themes in the Gospel of John, or these different sources, is what is called Aporias. And this is a fancy Greek word that simply means something like impasses, puzzles, or logical disjunctions. So there's these places that in the text itself, when you're doing sort of a literary reading of the text, you come across something that doesn't seem to quite fit. It doesn't logically progress as you might expect it to. We're going to look at a couple of these in just a second, but the prologue is sometimes called an aporia and sometimes not called an aporia. But so the impasse or the puzzle with respect to the prologue is, how does it fit with the rest of the gospel? There seem to be some differences between the prologue and the rest of the gospel. And the prologue really leads us into the narrative itself. So the question then is how the prologue fits with with the rest of the fourth gospel. And there's a couple different options that we'll present in just a moment here. But before we do that, I want to look at the prologue itself. It would behoove you to go ahead and pause the video right here. I'm not going to read the entire prologue for us, but for you to pause it and read these 18 verses before coming back in to hear my comments. So we have some differences from the rest of the gospel in the prologue, and we have some similarities to the rest of the gospel in the prologue. So there's ways in which the prologue seems to be different from the entirety of the fourth gospel, and it seems to be similar to the entirety of the fourth gospel. I want to highlight a couple of these. So one of the ways that the prologue is a puzzle is that its form is very different. It's this really sort of poetic format. It's not the sort of narrative form that we find in the rest of the gospel. It sort of has an elevated style to it in a way, and this poetic form is something different than we find not only with respect to the gospel, the rest of the gospel as a whole, but anywhere else in the fourth gospel. So there are no other places where we have this same sort of poetic form, which might suggest that we have something different going on with the prologue. We also have this interesting use of the first person plural pronoun we and us. So I've highlighted this for you in the latter fourth of the prologue. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. So this sort of intrusion of the first person plural appears in the prologue. And we also have some unique terms in the prologue that don't seem to show up often, or are not sort of thematic or programmatic to the rest of the gospel, that they seem to be something that is in a way unique to the prologue amongst the rest of the gospel. I'm going to highlight these in pink here. So this idea of the beginning, so in Greek, the second word of the prologue here. And this idea of the word repeated 3 times, the logos, this is a concept that doesn't show up. So we associate this often with the Gospel of John, and rightly so, because it's in the Gospel of John, but it doesn't show up elsewhere outside of the prologue. So you have this beautiful opening, sort of philosophically reflecting on the word of the logos that doesn't then again appear in the rest of the gospel. This came into being word is sort of this is a word of creation that doesn't seem to appear elsewhere in the gospel. The term grace is not a prominent theme in the Gospel of John. It is, of course, elsewhere in the New Testament, but this is not a word that we see often in John. And then also this word fullness. And the reason I highlight these particular terms is, one, because they're unique, but also because they seem to have some kind of relation to First John. So if you were to read First John in its entirety, the same is true with Second and Third John, you would see some of these concepts repeated there. So there's this interesting connection between the letters of John and the Gospel of John that sort of causes people to question what is the relationship, I should say that there are these unique similarities between the prologue of John and the letters of John. And this has caused people to question what is the prologue's relationship to these other Johannine letters. With respect to the similarities to the rest of the gospel, we do have a number of similarities between the prologue and the rest of the gospel. John the Baptist figures prominently, and really sort of as in the prologue as an intrusion. The comments about John the Baptist seem to interrupt the sort of poetic format of the prologue, and we'll talk about that intrusion, and you'll read about that intrusion when we come to John 1 later on in the semester, when we actually start to jump in full bore to reading commentaries on the gospel. But we have this similarity between the prominence of John the Baptist in the gospel proper and in the prologue itself. And the sort of basic idea of the prologue, or one basic idea in the prologue, that people become children of God through belief. This sort of sense that the Son comes into the world, people believe in the Son, and by doing so, that sort of connection of entering the world, belief, and becoming children of God is going to be a theme repeated throughout the rest of the gospel. And then we do have, whereas we have unique terms that are differences from the rest of the gospel, we do also have many, many terms that are shared with the rest of the gospel that appear often in the fourth gospel. And so I'm going to highlight these in orange for us. We have life, light, and darkness. So this is going to be a dualism we talk about later. Witness, the word world, belief, glory, and truth. These are all things that show up thematically very often in the fourth gospel and are reflected here in the prologue as well. And so these similarities and differences have caused scholars to think about the relationship between the prologue and the rest of the gospel in different kinds of ways. So the main question is sort of which comes first, the gospel or the prologue, or do they come at the same time? So is the prologue sort of a poetic, sort of worshipful introduction to a narrative that is already being used? So is it written after the fact as a sort of way to introduce the gospel, or is it written at the same time? So does the gospel writer, the author of John, start with the prologue and then move in to the narrative, or is it perhaps even written before, used in sort of a worship community setting, and then the gospel comes after? So all of these are possibilities, and they get at this idea of sort of thinking about the different relationships between the parts. So if the prologue is not written at the same time, is not written with the gospel, then we have two different sources that are relating to one another in some way, and then someone has to be bringing these sources together. And we see this same sort of idea of someone bringing sources together, not only at the beginning of the Gospel of John, but also at the end of the Gospel of John, the so-called epilogue in John 21. So here I give you the very end of John chapter 20, which seems to be a pretty good conclusion to the Gospel of John. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these things are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through believing you may have life in his name. So here we have themes from the entirety of the Gospel of John and a nice concluding statement, but then the Gospel continues on in chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. So we sort of have this awkward restarting, and another story begins. And then when we go down to the end of the Gospel of John at 21:25, we have sort of a repetition of some of the things that seem to have already been said in John 20:30. So we have, but there are also other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And then the Gospel concludes. So we seem to have maybe in John 21 a sort of added ending or an epilogue that is another source that is brought in to what had already been existing. And so then this raises the question, do we have additions with an A, the fourth gospel? Is the epilogue an example of a later addition? And if it is an example of a later addition, then perhaps we have multiple additions, that is to say, multiple sort of versions of the fourth gospel floating around that are yet to be finalized, and then at some point get finalized with what we now have as John 1 through 21. So you can see here the difference between the diachronic approach and the synchronic approach. The synchronic approach is going to say, well, let's look at what we do have now, John chapter 1 through 21. The diachronic approach is going to say, how did we get to having John 1 through 21? So to move from the beginning and the end more towards the sort of middle of the Gospel of John, we're really sort of still towards the beginning. There's some more of these Aporias in John 4, 5, 6, and 7. There seems to be an interesting ordering in these particular chapters. So what we find in John 4, 5, 6, and 7 is a number of different sort of things are going on. In chapters 4 and 6, we have these reflections on living water and living bread. So in John chapter 4, it's the Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus telling her about the living water that he can give. And then in John chapter 6, feeding the multitude and calling himself sort of this living bread, this the bread that gives eternal life. And so we have these themes of living elements that sustain a person in John chapter 4 and John chapter 6, but we also have a similarity in location, that Jesus is in Galilee talking about living sustenance in 4 and 6, whereas in 5 and 7, Jesus first talks about he performs a healing on the Sabbath, and then continues to reflect on that healing and the conflict that arose from that healing in chapter 7. So we have the healing on the Sabbath, and then the teaching about the law on the Sabbath and the conflict about doing so. And both of these are set in Jerusalem. So the location in John 5 and 7 is the same, and the location in John 4 and 6 is the same, which begs the question, should it actually be, or was it at one point actually John 4, John 6, John 5, and John 7? Was there a sort of different ordering of these episodes that got rearranged at some point in the Gospel of John's back history, or in its textual history? And one last example of this, of an aporia, or a sort of logical dislocation. We mentioned this one back in the Introduction to the New Testament class. John 14:31, Jesus is sort of speaking, giving a monologue, and he says, "Rise, let us be on our way." And then he and the disciples don't go on their way. Jesus continues to discourse for another 3 chapters. So in 15:1, immediately after John 14:31, he starts talking about how he's the true vine. And it's not until John 18 that Jesus finishes the discourse, and then the disciples and him leave. So they actually get on their way 3 chapters after Jesus says that he's going to get on his way. So all of these are sort of examples of where we might see literary seams, or where we might see examples of different sources being used in the 4th gospel. And it leads to lots of different questions. Do we have a single author of the Gospel of John, or do we have multiple authors writing different parts of it? Should we be thinking about an editor for the Gospel of John that's bringing these different sources together and writing in little bits to connect them? Is the Gospel of John sort of a tradition in progress, something that was developing over a period of time? And as I said, much of the Johannine scholarship of the 20th century, so from 1900 until 2000, was concerned with answering these kinds of questions and trying to figure out what are the different literary parts of the Gospel of John that might have been brought together. And so I'm going to call your attention to, or I'm going to briefly explain 2 of the prominent composition theories for the 4th Gospel. The first is from Rudolf Bultmann's commentary, and he proposed that there were 3 different sources that were used. This sort of saying source that had things that Jesus said about what he was revealing about the Father. There was a signs source that contained the sort of miracles in the Gospel of John, especially in the first half of it, and then a passion source that told about or contained information about Jesus's death and resurrection in the last, that we see in the last half of John. And that these different sources, that there were sort of stages in their development, that they were written at different times. At some point, they started to be brought together and reordered, or the different individual sources were also reordered in different kinds of ways before they were finalized and brought together. And in some cases were brought together out of order, such as in John 4 through 7. And sort of Bultmann's theory has continued to have influence in scholarship, and was sort of this pillar of how people thought about John in scholarship for a really long time. And it continued to be even down to this next composition theory, which is now probably, for those who continue to do this diachronic sort of work, Raymond Brown's theory tends to be the favored diachronic theory at this point, and it uses a lot of the same ideas that Bultmann's does, but advances it in different kinds of ways. And I note here that Rudolf Bultmann's commentary was published in 1941, so we have 60 years later Raymond Brown's final edition of his theory published in 2003, and it's of interest that Raymond Brown's own theory of Johannine composition came about in different stages and was later edited by someone after his own death. So someone else edited this final edition of his theory, taking his own sources, Raymond Brown's own sources, and stringing them together, as it were, as is Brown's and Bultmann's theory of what happened with the fourth gospel. So for Raymond Brown, we have different stages of how the tradition progressed. So at stage one, we have the beloved disciple, who is named as the writer or the author of the Gospel of John in the gospel itself. So at stage one, we have the beloved disciple who has these memories, who is an actual follower of Jesus, and was someone who left the ministry of John the Baptist, was sort of a follower of John the Baptist, left John the Baptist's discipleship, and started to follow Jesus. So that's stage one. And then from there, the beloved disciple becomes a sort of pillar in the Johannine community, that his own memories and preaching were given and then passed along in sort of an oral form by him and by others, until then later in stage three, that these memories were written down by the evangelist, who is not the same person as the beloved disciple. And then that sort of writing, what was written down from the memories of the beloved disciple, later get finalized by a redactor. So even in stage three, you have sort of two sub stages here. So once again, we have different sources, whether memorial or written, that are being used in different kinds of ways. All of this looking at the back history of the text. And I give you all of that as context because you're going to see it show up often in the Johannine scholarship that you read this semester. So having a sense of what was the favored approach to thinking about the world of the text and the text behind the text still shows up in the scholarship today, and still sort of has some kind of influence, even though it's not going to be the primary way that we engage the world of the text in this class. It's not going to be the way that I primarily engage it, and it's not going to be the way that I primarily ask you to engage it. Rather, and what is more important for your exegetical skill sets that you will develop in this class, is really taking a synchronic approach, focusing on the text as we have it, and not being as concerned with the back history of the text and trying to figure out how the different sources might fit together. So our focus is really going to be on the final form of the text. And one of the ways that we're going to engage this the world of the text in this synchronic fashion a number of different ways this semester. We're going to sort of develop different literary skill sets. But what I want to do in this video, in our time that remains, is sort of just outline some of the unique literary characteristics of John's narrative for you to be on the lookout for as you read the fourth gospel and as you begin to engage in literary analysis of the text. So these are things to sort of be aware of, and when I close out the video, I'm going to ask you to practice looking for these in a particular passage that you might be interested in working on this semester. So one of the things that is unique to John is the signs. The signs in John are these miracles, but they're not called miracles as they are in the Synoptic Gospels. So we have a particular word, signs, semeia in Greek, that are outlined really in the first half of the Gospel. So there are 7 of these. Another literary characteristic of John is that the number 7 often features prominently, that things happen in sevens. And I've listed them here. I'm not going to read through them, but you'll notice that they all happen in chapters 2 through 11, and there seems to be that then John chapter 1, while it doesn't contain any signs, is related to these signs in some way, as is the chapter that comes next, John chapter 12, and we sort of have we seem to have some kind of break at John chapter 12, and things change in John chapter 13 when Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And we begin to get the sort of narrative account of Jesus's last days in Jerusalem. So the book of signs is, John 1 through 12 is often called the book of signs because it relays these different miracles or signs, and they are signs because they point to Jesus's identity, that narrates a period of several years of Jesus's life, whereas the book of glory, these last 8-9 chapters, really focus on Jesus's last days and his glorification through death and resurrection. So we have this sort of twofold division, almost an even half and half split between the book of signs and the book of glory. In the Gospel of John, uniquely, we have a number of really long monologues and really long dialogues. So we'll find Jesus discoursing, sort of rambling might not be the most charitable verb, but talking on at length, either sort of by himself to people, or in some cases in dialogue, where someone will come to Jesus and they will have a back and forth dialogue that sometimes even leads into a monologue, that the other dialogue partner begins to fade away, and Jesus again begins to speak at length in more of a monologue kind of form. In John, we have Jesus moving between Galilee and Jerusalem. So he sort of goes back and forth. We already saw this a little bit in John 4 through 7. But in the Synoptic Gospels, we have Jesus primarily doing his ministry in Galilee and then going to Jerusalem one time when he's going to die. Whereas in the Gospel of John, we have this back and forth movement between Galilee and Jerusalem. And it's often because Jesus is going to Jerusalem to celebrate different kinds of festivals, Passover, booths, or the Festival of Dedication, which we now call Hanukkah. We also have some sort of characters function in a unique way in the Gospel of John. We have this unique relationship between the Father and the Son, and much reflection on the Father and the Son in the Gospel of John as compared to the Synoptic Gospels. We have the Jews as a sort of blanket group. We'll be talking much more about the Jews as the semester progresses, but rather than the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes that appear prominently in the Synoptic Gospels, we do also see them in John, but they're more lumped together into this one group that John is going to call the Jews. Then, of course, we have the disciples, who are sort of a foil to the Jews in the Gospel of John. We have some prominent women characters in the Gospel of John who sort of function to do a number of really different important things in the narrative, and also reaching outside the narrative to the audience. And we also have these minor characters that have major roles. Oftentimes we have these minor characters who aren't even given a name in the Gospel of John, but they do really important things. And they exhibit especially belief in really important ways. John also has this duality to it, where there's sort of polar opposites. And everything of all these I've listed, you want to be on the left side of all of these dualisms, and all of the things on the left side are sort of related to one another in some way or another, and everything on the right side is also sort of related to one another. So we have of God or of the devil, from above or from below, not of this world or of this world, believing or not believing, light, dark, love and hate, true and false. And then we also have a number of different kinds of misunderstandings where characters, oftentimes characters that are sort of antagonistic towards Jesus, will misunderstand something, and Jesus will sometimes explain it, but sometimes things will be left unexplained, that the characters will never get the explanation to their misunderstanding. And it's a way for the author of John to sort of connect with us as the audience, because we understand what's going on. There's sort of a narrative satisfaction to us understanding what is happening in the misunderstanding of the characters in the narrative. And lastly, John is famous for its I am statements. And this is, of course, hearkening back to Exodus chapter 3, the revelation of the divine name in the Hebrew Bible. But John will do this in ways, sometimes the I am stands on its own on a couple of occasions, but more often it's an I am with a symbol. So Jesus will say, I am this. And the symbols vary: bread, light, gate, shepherd, resurrection, the way, the life, and the vine. So all kinds of different I am statements, plus a symbol that is associated with it. And again, or not again, also in the Gospel of John, we have this rich symbolism, that John uses symbolism especially to relay the relationship between Jesus and the Father, the Son and the Father. So these are things to be on the lookout for as we begin to engage the world of the text. And I want to close us out by asking you to go and look for them in the passage that you might be interested in working on this semester. So I've mentioned before that you should try and choose a passage that you are sort of consistently working with. Oftentimes in these lecture pauses and for assignments, I'm going to be asking you to do particular things. So if you have not yet chosen a passage that you would like to sort of consistently work on, you can begin this lecture pause by trying to identify one of those. And once you do, or if you have already, turn to that passage in John, read it, and be on the lookout for these different literary characteristics, whether diachronic or synchronic, that we've just noted in this passage. So I'm going to leave you to do that now and say goodbye.